Plugged in? Okay. First of all, got a bit of apology. Most fathers get slippers for Father's Day. I got tonsillitis off my little boy, so my voice is on its last legs today. So yeah, we're going to talk about how to apply some of these data quality dimensions that you probably read about in the white paper, or you may have heard about before. How do you actually put them into a data quality framework? And what I'm going to do at the very end as well, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to trap some of these data quality dimensions that you, in a slightly different way to what you might have come across before. Very quickly about me, I'm not going to go through this. Founder of dataqualitypro.com, datamigrationpro.com, also involved with course management for PDM V2, practical data migration now online, all sorts of different stuff. If you want to find out about some of the data quality dimension stuff I write about, probably dataqualitypro.com is the best place to go. If you search on there, we cover that in quite a lot of detail. 3 parts. The first part I'm going to talk about is why it's so difficult to embed. I'm going to call them DQDs because we're running out of time all the way through. But I've been involved with DQDs since about 1992, I guess, and there's a kind of traditional kind of pain barrier you go through every time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. How you overcome some of those growing pains, and I'm going to give you some simple tips at the end, how to cope with DQDs in kind of non-traditional sort of data sets that you might not have come across before, but it's typically where a lot of companies get started as well. So I've been trying to get my little boy to learn the guitar because I've been playing guitar for many years, and I thought I'll get my 7-year-old. We'll have a weekend intensive session and we'll get him started. So in many ways, I see DQDs when you're trying to implement them for the first time, it's exactly like that type of that approach. So you start off with a dreamlike vision. I just had a vision of my son being able to sit down with a guitar and just diligently play it every night and practice and really take it on board and tell all his friends about it, how fantastic it is. And we didn't really get off to a great start, and because we realised straight away that needed an incentive. And we got some blockading literally within the first 30 minutes. Just didn't want to do it. So we had to introduce ice cream as a bit of a treat to get through the very first session. And this is what you find when you're starting out with DQDs, you'll find that it's just such an alien concept to most organisations because they focused on business or doing things in healthcare or insurance or whatever. DQDs come kind of out of left field. So you have to typically come up with some kind of bribe to really get them moving. And obviously the idea is that you're trying to incentivise based on the work they're already doing. But a lot of people come at it from a kind of academic approach, which is where you can hit some kind of brick wall straight away. So you get some teething issues which are quite, in my experience, that they start fairly early on in the process when like I say, you're trying to get people to move from the situation that they were in before to where you want them to go now. And it's typically down to, it's as much change management as a technical thing. It's very much about, you've got a vision and you're passionate about it, but they don't feel a sense of change, they don't feel the sense of urgency because they're going about their work, and you're trying to take them out of their daily work to do all these other things. So you kind of get these teething issues that start to emerge, and then you get this scapegoating, oh, it's your fault, you're going too fast, no, you're not going fast enough, and all the sponsors start kind of getting a little bit embattled with it. Because the big challenge is if you're working in a centre of excellence and you're trying to impose these things, then obviously you've got your own agendas, you're trying to move the company forward with data quality and data governance, but these guys have, they might work in a call centre, for example, and they're trying to meet their 2-minute call delivery times and all these kind of things. So quite often, and this is a kind of perpetual cycle I've seen in every company, you kind of get this finger pointing and scapegoating going on as you try and implement some of these things. And gradually other priorities kind of pull rank and momentum starts to get lost. In our case, they wanted to go on the Wii and the iPad in the afternoon, and that was it. It was kind of, we just couldn't get him back into playing the guitar. So I see this kind of cycle every time. So I'm going to give you some ideas on how you can kind of break out of that in a moment. But this is typically what I see with a DQD kind of implementation. So why are DQDs so challenging? Well, the thing is, your vision has to align with their reality. You can't approach it from an academic exercise. There's so many books on DQDs and data quality, and the one message I get every single time from someone who just takes that book and tries to apply it in the organisation is they just hit a brick wall, because they're not relaying it to the reality that the people have on the ground, because they're just doing their day-to-day job. So there has to be a big incentive. And in the past, when I've done this, the very first organisation I started back in '92, I tried to implement something similar to this, but it was kind of ISO 9001, and we had dimensions and all this kind of thing, and I tried to implement it on a data entry team, and I just failed, just dismally. I just could not get it to work. And then I said, well, okay, how about if I coach you in some techniques which will help you put more skills in your CV and get a better job, and the room was full the next morning. You know, it was just for training sessions. I couldn't get anyone first week, second week, I just couldn't keep them away. So it's a lesson there. You've got to try and put it in a way that makes sense to them and gives them the advantage. The time frames have to be realistic as well. You know, despite what people say, you're not going to crack this overnight. I've been in organisations where it's taken them up to a decade to try and put some of these things like KPIs and DQDs in across the enterprise. So certainly, you know, give it at least 6 months to a year before you can kind of really roll these out across even a department. Don't try and go too fast. So obviously, the core techniques are actually quite straightforward to teach, but mastery does take many months, obviously sometimes years. The big takeaway, though, is that you have to have this kind of core maturity in data quality, really, before you can start to talk about some of these more abstract techniques. For example, things like when you talk about dimensions, a lot of people, you know, you have your kind of your dimensions such as uniqueness and completeness and accuracy, things like that, which are fairly relatively easy to kind of measure. But when you get into things like believability, understandability, trust and things like that, they can be quite abstract terms. So you have to have this core kind of foundation of data quality before you can start introducing a lot of these more abstract terms. That's what I've found as well in the past. Okay, so how do we cope with some data quality growing pains? Well, the big thing I found, when I see organisations that are struggling with data quality and obviously data quality dimensions, it's because they're applying kind of the wrong horse for the course, if you like. A good example is I spoke to someone who's responsible for trying to put in a really kind of broad data quality framework, and it just didn't work, because the organisation just wasn't at a level of maturity to even cope with change, let alone widespread data quality. And they were trying to introduce probably the biggest data information quality framework, and everyone was just absolutely blockading it because they just weren't ready for that base level change yet. And so it's kind of horses for courses. You know, you need a different horse for the different type of course you're on. A horse for show jumping is very different to the horse you would have on a flat race or a jump. And the important thing here is that we're all on different courses. So a good example would be if you've bought, say, Arcadia Made in Chick's book. It's very, very prescriptive about data quality rules, and they link into data quality dimensions quite easily. Redmond's methodologies at a little bit higher level. The 10 steps is focused on projects. It's not focused on big programs and data governance and things like that. It's about, this is how you do a data quality project from start to finish. And this applies as well to where you are in the organisation. A lot of people start off with very small local initiatives, maybe a data cleanse in a small department, and then you go to a bigger local kind of initiative. Perhaps you're pulling together different teams to try and do some improvement, and then you might move into a bigger department, a wider area, all the way through to enterprise. And what you'll find is data quality dimensions will change as you move through these layers. They won't always stay the same. The way you discover them and measure them, and the way you report on them will differ, as it will depending on which methodology you're applying as well. I mean, ISO 8000, for example, is very, very prescriptive about requirements and specifying your data quality rules in very, very, very finite detail. Whereas if you look at some of the other methodologies, like Mike 2 and things like that, DMBOK, they don't go into that level. They sit above that a little bit more. So I mean, a good example, I'm just going to go through a couple of examples here of how you can start to apply some of the things you've seen in the white paper actually on the ground in some of your projects. So this is from Arcadia Made in Chick Data Quality Assessment book, and I've just quickly sort of sketched out a bit of a framework that runs through the book. As you can see, he basically structures around constraints, data quality rules, so domain constraints, relational integrity, different rules across there. Now, validity actually has a kind of one-to-many relationship within his framework. You have attribute formats, valid values, precision constraints, things like that. So you can use frameworks like Made in Chicks to take the raw materials that you're seeing in some of these white papers and then break them out into more detailed representations. Things like uniqueness, timeliness, consistency. And what you'll find is that there is no kind of one size fits all. You find that you have to take little bits and pieces. So Danette McGilvray, for example, she, in her 10 Steps book, she covers additional dimensions. I think she has sort of like 12 dimensions. I think Tom Redman has slightly less. Larry English has, I can't remember, like 40. Everyone has their own different set. So the thing is, obviously, you have to pick the ones which apply most readily to your organisation, depending on where you are in terms of your life cycle. Like I say, if you're on a small local initiative, then it could be that you're mostly concerned with things like timeliness. Are you getting the order information in correctly? You might not be less concerned about the formats and things like that, because if you're an engineering team, you can kind of sometimes work around that. But is the data timely and accurate? That's really what you're focused on. So you've got to pick the right the right data quality dimensions that relate to where you are in the organisation and the particular task you're trying to complete. This is from EFQM, a typical kind of quality framework, but they've kind of made this from a data quality perspective. So within there you can see that the controlling area is probably where you would apply the data quality dimensions piece. So it's where the business impact is identified and related data quality measures are defined and managed. And it's where quality of data is permanently monitored and acted upon. So that's where you would put your data quality dimensions piece in there within the EFQM. And as you can see, everything kind of builds on top of it then. So organisational people, processes and methods all sit above that data quality dimensions piece. But the key thing I've learned, you can lose a lot of support for DQDs in a heartbeat if you're not very clear about what you're actually talking about when you say things like completeness and uniqueness. A good example was I once wrote a report where I wrote about exchange, doing some work for telco, and I said 97% complete. And I just literally had a verbal attack coming back across the table, because it's like, what does this mean? We're engineers. What does this actually mean? And I just done some basic profiling, saw the data was 3% was incomplete, so I wrote it down in the report. So you've got to be very, very careful when you're using phrases like this, because what it really meant was 3% of active primary transmission racks commissioned against service accounts have missing port identifiers. And the engineers went, oh yeah, right, great, we'll go away and fix those. But 3% incomplete means very little to that audience. So that's what I'm saying. When you're creating DQDs, you have to think about your audience, where you are in terms of your project life cycle, and the life cycle of data quality and data governance as well. As you move further and further up the organisation, it changes in terms of the scope and the amount of underlying rules that you need to support those data quality dimensions. A good example, I run a private kind of data quality manager forum exclusively for DQ managers worldwide, and someone wrote a question in there today, said, what is the customer contact data completeness percentage in your organisation? Because they said they're a fixed line telco, and they are 50% customers of email, 76% mobile phone. And it was interesting because other people started to respond and said, oh, in our organisation it's this, our organisation it's that. So I could see mentally that the person who posted that question was comparing their completeness a metric against what everyone else was writing. And that's a very dangerous thing to do if you don't understand the underlying rules that went into them collecting their metric. Because a good example would be, are those active customers? Are those historical customers? Are they customers that are opted in and are marketable to? Is the data really accurate? Some organisations have very accurate data, some just let the data drift. Was it commercial customers, residential? Perhaps a better question to ask, for your residential customers that are contactable, what kind of completeness are you getting? Because the whole point was this guy obviously wanted to know what is a good rate of completeness for, say, emails, and mobile phones, such that they could do some campaigns. So you've got to have the context behind some of these data quality dimensions, because if you get them wrong, or if you try and compare, you're trying to compare apples with apples. So if you're trying to compare completeness in, say, customer data in the billing department and customer data in, say, the fulfillment or marketing, it can mean very different things. And as a result, when you come to report those back up to the board level, your report's going to look very skewed, and you can get into a lot of trouble. I've found in the past where unless you specify exactly what those terms mean, you're going to have a lot of problems. It's not just a case of just scaling up your data quality metrics or your profiling results from the ground up all the way up to the top of the organisation. It changes as you move across the organisation and up. So you really have to think about how you're building those rules to get those end values. So some big takeaways on this section there. So your DQDs must be relevant for where you are in the data quality lifecycle. Like I said, small project, localized fixes versus enterprise initiatives. Whether you're in a broad sweep, it will vary considerably. A DQD must enable some form of action. And this is the biggest one. So many times, particularly when I was starting out and doing data profiling and things like this, you would present the results, and the business would just be completely uninterested. It's like, well, what can I do with that? You know, you're showing it's 80% complete or it's 97% formatted correctly. You need to have your dimensions in such a way that someone can take them and go away and do something. Because the question you always want to be saying is, which means that? You know, it's 97% complete, which means that. And that's the bit that the business really wants to understand. It's like, what can they do with that information? And quite often that's lacking, I think. When you just hand over a bunch of profiling results, you sometimes lose that impetus and activity that you want someone to go away and do. And the next one, obviously, is they need to be specified precisely. And this is why it's great, I think, things like ISO 8000 coming on, because I've interviewed like Peter Benson, one of the sort of founding fathers of ISO 8000, and he's just fanatical about, you get talking to him about hair colour. My God, he could talk for 4 hours about the requirements for hair colour. Is it dyed? Is it eye colour? The same that you can change your eye colour and all this sort of thing. Because obviously, been working with the US government and things like that. The Homeland Security, they have such strict definitions on what these things mean, and that kind of spills through into your data quality dimensions. You can't just say completeness or uniqueness or accuracy. You have to be extremely specific about that, what that means, and you have to document those rules such that if people interrogate them, you can actually show where those rules came from and what they mean. So I've talked a little bit about theory now, and what I want to do is just quickly go into kind of fancy dashboard fashion, because there's a lot of people think that when you're doing data quality dimensions, it's about completeness or formatting and running column profiling stats and pulling back data quality dimensions that way. And obviously that is one of the ways you can do it, but there's a lot of data that doesn't always conform to that view of the world. And I'm just going to give you an example of some data I've got now. It's simulated data, but it kind of comes from a real life scenario where the kind of traditional data quality approach kind of breaks down in a way. So this is coffee data from a very large supermarket chain, and I'm just going to show you how some of these kind of core techniques that in terms of some of the dimensions, how this would be applied to this data set. So I'm just going to, fortunately we've got a bit of a, I normally run this on a 24-inch screen, so it's going to be quite interesting to see how it copes with it. Yeah, I've got the screen this size inside Windows 97. Isn't it? Okay, so on the screen here, okay, so I'm going to sit down for a second. Okay, so down the side here we've got lots of different product descriptions, and this is typically what you will see. So what this is showing is that we have 52 records for Cafe Direct, all the way down through Dow Egberts and Lavazza Cafe. So when you're trying to find completeness, one of the things you're looking for is nulls. Okay, so here if I switch off this field here and just to show me no values, I can see the typical kind of null check. So here I found one record that doesn't have a product description. Okay, so that's failed my completeness check. Now, one of the things you have to look for as well is that there are implied nulls, and again this is a common error that I see a lot of people make. They'll run some profiling stats, and if you've got many millions of records and you're not doing this kind of thing, you can really skew your completeness stats. So I'm going to show you how we would do that on this one. So I'm just going to do a reverse sort, hopefully, and I don't know if you can see it because the resolution is not great, but what you can see here is we got a lot of low value coming through here. So we can see here, not supplied by Dow Egberts, TBC, maybe 227 grams, pending. Okay, now I remember once doing this on a telco data set, and I ran through the standard is it not null completeness check, and we had about 98% was fine completed. Then we started seeing these TBC or Fred is waiting on Juniper to send the rack, or we found literally hundreds of thousands of these little anomalies where people they hadn't written null in there because the system required some data to go in, but they put implied nulls, and you've got to be careful with completeness, because that's what it means. Is the data incomplete? So where someone says pending or not supplied or waiting on Dow Egberts or TBC or whatever, that is effectively null. Okay, because no one has entered a value in there yet that can be used for the business. You might say, well, it's not a valid format, but I would argue, say, well, no, it's incomplete. The data is not complete, and this is where you have to be very specific about your completeness rules, so that you apply the same kind of measures across the organisation. So that's one example of completeness that can actually trip up a lot of people. I see this time and time again with people getting started with profiling tools, for example. And what you can do over time is you can build up rules to search for things like TBC, N/A, and just things that just don't look quite right within the data. Okay, let me show you another example now. So another aspect of completeness is what we call coverage. Okay, so I mean, if we look at the description the guys put in the white paper this week around completeness, I think it was, sorry, just bring up the definition again so we can remind ourselves. So completeness is a measure of the absence of blank values or the presence of non-null blank values. Okay, so another aspect is, another problem that a lot of people face is when you profile data, or you whether you use SQL or whatever it is to look at data, you kind of take a column by column view. So you look in the data and say, show me everything that isn't there. Okay, but here's a good example of stuff that is incomplete, but you would never find it using that conventional method. So here we're showing time series data in a data mart, sort of data warehouse style system for coffee. Now, this one down here shows all of our coffee records, all of our records throughout the year. You sometimes see this at the start of the year. You might have some missing brands because they don't sort of post early in the year, and same towards the end of the year. So that data looks fine. So it looks as though we have full coverage throughout the year. But if we start to look at the coverage per brand, we see something slightly different. We see that some of the brands don't have. Sorry, I can't bring it across. Okay, so we see that the brands have covered, and then we start to see, okay, so Lions didn't post any, didn't send any, because what happens at this supermarket, the brands send the information into them. So Lions did not have any coffee records supplied up to the first quarter. Okay, now because there's so much missing information, you might say, okay, well that's probably because they only came on board as a supplier after Q1 or something like that. But what we can do is we start to move across. Sorry, move up. Okay, where is it? There we go. So we see at Kenco missed a time period. So they've got low volumes. So quite often, depending on the sort of scale you're on your chart, you might miss these as well. But low volumes, and then we had a miss here. Okay, so we thought, well, why do we miss some data? Okay, so in this example kind of simulates what happens quite often when you have a feed going into a data mart and there's been a system fail or something like that. When you have masses and masses of data mart data and warehouse data, you can miss things like this quite easily, because the results still look reasonably okay, the counts look okay across all of your brands, but it's easy to miss one. So that is an example of incompleteness. So it's kind of like the coverage aspect of completeness. You don't have full coverage of the data. Now these rules can be quite tricky to specify, because obviously you need to maintain them over time, because Kenco may have had a recall across their entire brand, for example, for that week, and they pulled all brands off the stock. So again, the point I'm trying to get across here is that data quality dimensions aren't static. Sometimes you actually need to continuously manage them over and over again. Okay, talk about uniqueness now. So The uniqueness definition is no thing will be recorded more than once based upon how that thing is identified. And the point here is that most people think of uniqueness as a primary key violation, for example. So I may have if on my broadband account or something, I may have been duplicated twice as a customer. I'm getting 2 bills or 2 brochures for broadband or whatever. So that's what people typically think of uniqueness, but it can also apply to, in an example here, we've got some data mart data where you have duplicate entries for the same item across the same time period. And these can be quite tricky to spot. And what we've done here, I've just created a pivot table. And what we've got, as we come down, we can see we've got Cafe Direct, and what we see, because these are 5-week periods, you would expect to see five identifiers in across that period. That makes sense. Okay, so for each time period, we've got five entries. But what we see here is that we've got Cafe Direct, Fair Trade Kilimanjaro, and here we've got Cafe Direct. Which one is it? That one. Cafe Direct, Fair Trade Kilimanjaro. So what's happened, obviously, is that someone's tried to search for that product, not been able to find it, and they put it in as that. So what we've effectively got is a duplicate entry, and it conforms to this rule. It conforms to the uniqueness rule here. No thing will be recorded more than once based upon how that thing is identified. We identify it by product description, by time period. Okay, but the point is you've got a combination here of 2 different rule violations. You've got a formatting rule violation, because what's happened is Cafe Direct have sent their data with the E with the accent on, and that's caused a problem in the system. Someone's obviously tried to fudge that and just call it Cafe Direct without the accent, and as a result that's created a duplicate record. Now, this is another kind of warning for you. When you start to find, say, formatting issues and validity dimension errors, and you start to clean them up, you can introduce knock-on dimension errors in other areas. It's like here, you may clean the formatting error, but instantly you're going to create a uniqueness or duplication error. So you've really got to think about how you're approaching your dimensions, because obviously dimensions are really something for action. So if you're improving, quite often you can actually create these knock-on problems as well. Finally, I'm not going to go through lots more because I know we're coming up on time, but the domain validity is the next one. In this example here, we've got the Fair Trade, we've got all these different domains, and clearly you can see some of these values are not valid. You've got Y, question mark, TBC, UK for unknown, no value. But what's interesting, if you look at, so if we just say highlight the, we'll take the traditional no and the yes, we'll keep those. We can actually see that we've got some other domain values down here as well. We've got a yes in capitals and a yes in uppercase and lowercase. Now, this, so the system has picked that up as exactly the same domain. So one of the things you've got to be careful of is that some of the tool, depending on which tool you're using, how you're doing it, some of these little domain issues can creep through and can slip through, and you might not notice them. So here you need to define, well, is it all uppercase, or is it uppercase, lowercase? What is the actual rule for it? So it's just a good example of how you have to be very, very specific about your domain validations for when you're doing the validity DQD. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a slightly different perspective on what you typically look at in terms of sort of data for data quality interventions. So quick recap. So DQDs are fantastic at creating tangible actions within your organisation, but they have to reflect the needs of the business. For example, you wouldn't show profiling stats to executives. You have to interpret what that means to people at that level. You can't discover every rule automatically. Even with the most sophisticated DQ technology, you need to go through this process of workshopping, discovering. It never ends. And like I showed before, the rule there for one of the coffee products, that rule would have to constantly evolve over time. You couldn't just cast it in stone once. Data profiling and discovery tools help you uncover the raw materials of DQDs, but it often needs quite complex rules to really manage them well. So things like timeliness, for example, being able to check whether your stock prices across the entire organisation are all accurate and timely at the same time. Sometimes you need slightly different approaches for that. And if your data models are historical or abstract, you need to think outside of the box sometimes. So the point I was making there was that data I was looking at there was data warehouse data, data mart type data. You need to think slightly differently to the column by column approach. Abstract data models, you need to kind of decompose them a little bit and really get in amongst it to understand what the rules are. And that's, I know we're running over a little bit, but if you've got any questions, obviously we've got a session afterwards, but you can feel free to email me. I can send you the data in this sheet. I can send you the product as well, and the worksheet that goes with it. So it's going to go through and sort of trap some of these errors. It might just help you think slightly differently about data quality dimensions. But that's me done. I don't know if you've got any questions or whether you want to wait for the panel. How do you want to do it? Yeah.